is John Connolly. I'm with the Council of State Administrators of Vocational Rehabilitation, and Tim asked me if I would moderate the panel this afternoon. So our session this afternoon is in regard to expectations of state VR employers and service providers for collaboration and coordination among technical assistance centers, research and training centers, and other federally funded projects. So it's an opportunity to hear from the customers and the practitioners this afternoon. So I will ask our panel members if they could introduce themselves. Pat, do you want to start? Sure.
Good afternoon. My name is Pat Maher. I am Director of Civic Engagement for SPR Consulting. We're an IT solutions company based in Chicago as well as offices in Milwaukee. And I'm responsible for engaging with historically marginalized communities into the workforce, specifically into tech roles, as well as representing SPR in the broader kind of civic tech, developing civic tech community, particularly in the Chicagoland area.
I'm Ellie Hartman. I'm the Wisconsin Promise Project Manager. I'm employed through UW Stout, and then Promise is the Voc Rehab Agency here in Wisconsin. DVR is a lead agency for Promise, so I'm actually housed within the VR there. Promise is a federal research grant through the Department of Ed, Special Ed area, OSEP. And it's also a cross-agency collaboration. So Social Security is the evaluator for that grant, and they have a national evaluator, Mathematica. So we work with multiple agencies for this demonstration grant, and we also have a technical assistance center for the Promise grants, plus like I said, Promise in Wisconsin is housed within Voc Rehab. So we interact with many different partners as part of this.
Good afternoon. I'm Allison Flanagan. I'm the director of the Kentucky Blind Agency, the public VR program. And my agency has been involved with the Institute on Community Inclusion on a learning collaborative, specifically around business service teams. And we are also one of the 4 states that are involved in a demonstration grant on the career pathways, and that's through RSA, so that's kind of exciting for us. And we are actually just 7-8 months into that grant. It's a 5-year grant, so stay tuned on that grant.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jim Marks, and much to the astonishment of my mother and wife, I'm the director of VR in Montana. It's a combined agency. I've been there almost 7 years now, and before that, I came to Voc Rehab through my work at the University of Montana as a Disability Services Director there, and before that, Independent Living. So I got lots to say.
Well, thank you. And the way we've structured this, we've developed a series of questions, and about 5 questions to take us through the hour. The first question, and I know some of the folks in their introductions on the panel have touched on this to some degree and may have more to add, but the first question is, as a starting point, can you share your current collaborations with any DOL, OSERS, or NIDLR grantee or contractor and or universities?
Do you want to go?
Howard, do you want to start again? You did a great job leading off the introduction.
I'm happy to. I'm very long-winded, so I'll make this my last long-winded comment. No, I mentioned to John that my role is somewhat unique. Obviously, I don't have the experience, the government experience that the balance of the panel or the educational experience has. I've really been in private industry my entire career, mostly in client development and client management. However, SPR, I was brought in 2004 to direct a channel of SPR focused on candidates and transitioning professionals with disabilities. A few years following that, I was exposed to Dave Strouser down at the University of Illinois. I'm an alum of U of I. I reached out to Brad Hedrick in Dres down in Champaign on another topic, and by extension, he put me in touch with Dave. I've now been engaged with Professor Fong Chan here at the University of Wisconsin, Professor Strouser and Professor Wieman at VCU. We've collaborated on 2 grants. One is in its second year now. I know it's administered by Paul's team, and my work is under Professor Chan, which is obviously looking at demand side aspects of employability. So what I've been able to do for the professors, I think, is cull private organizations, some large, some smaller, some mid-market, and probably some Fortune 500 to 1000s, to establish some critical thinking from the demand side that the academic team might not otherwise have had access to. We've now got several grants pending. I expect these are all DOL or OSEP. And again, the focus for me as a consultant is engaging employers in critical discussions on creating toolkits, establishing a more marketable candidate from the employer's perspective.
And I'll just expand a little bit from my introduction. So the different folks that we're working with, I mentioned the Department of Ed, OSEP grant. So we have our project directors from there. Then there's Social Security Administration, because Wisconsin Promise is for youth receiving SSI, Supplemental Security Income, and their families. So Social Security is very interested to see what impact this will have. Providing extra transition services and supports for youth and families. And then through Social Security, they have a contract with Mathematica to provide the national evaluation. And then here in Wisconsin, we work with different university partners as part of our state program, our state evaluation. So UW-Stout is the lead agency for our state eval, and then partnering with UW-Madison. So those are and then the Technical Assistance Center for the Promise Grants is AUCD, the Association of University Centers for Developmental Disabilities. They typically are the technical assistance centers for like the USED and things like that, but are the Promise Technical Assistance Center. And Michael Gamble McCormick is the lead on that, and he helped with, he was one of the folks who helped work on the WIOA legislation. So he brings a lot of that information as part of that Technical Assistance Center.
As I mentioned before, several years ago, we worked with the Institute on Community Inclusion on a learning collaborative which was focused on business service teams. And this really paralleled well with the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, which is the focus on business and employer relations. This was actually before ICI was awarded the JDVR tax. So once they were awarded that, our relationship was established, and it's allowed us as a state agency, not just the blind, but also the general agency, because we both worked on this initiative, to continue that relationship with them as they continue on the technical assistance piece. And I'm going to talk a little bit more, as a state VR agency, especially the blind agency, because anybody know how many blind agencies there are out there, separate? Yeah, there's but 25 of us, so half of what you would find with general our combined agencies. So sometimes, because we are a much smaller population, it's easy to overlook those agencies, and the research that is out there is not very specific to our population. So I'm constantly raising my hand whenever you see these research or evidence-based practices and asking, was there anything specific done for the blind and visually impaired? Because I came from the general agency, 17 years there. I've been with the blind agency for 6 years. Rehab, the Rehab Act, yep, it's there. It's like, I know it, I understand it, until I went to the blind agency. And there are very different approaches and very different successes in the blind agencies. I can attest to this. A lot of similarities, but there still has to be a different approach for the blind and visually impaired. So that's one of the things that I'm always talking with the TA centers out there, is making sure that the blind and visually impaired agencies are being equally included in the research and the evidence-based. So that's part of my role as a director, is making sure that we have that voice and that what you are looking into is making sure it's applicable to our population. With the Career Pathways Grant, which is the one that I'm working with RSA on, obviously we were focusing not only on the blind and visually impaired, but because our population is so small, we included the Kentucky General Agency. So we are focusing on that transition age as well as the adult age, and looking at because it's a demonstration grant, we're having to demonstrate our philosophy, and our approach to this grant was hiring career pathway coordinators. And will those specialized coordinators in specific sectors bring that expertise needed with the post-secondary education entity, as well as the employers and businesses, improve outcome for our population? So that's what we're trying to demonstrate in our grant. So that relationship, with the TA centers obviously is very valuable, just as with OSERS and NIDLR and all of those. So as a state agency, I encourage everyone to continue thinking about how the public rehab needs your input, and obviously those proven strategies for us to keep increasing.
Before I talk about Montana, I neglected to mention in my introduction that I'm the chairman of the research committee for the Council of State Administrators of Vocational Rehabilitation. And that committee, the committee purposes have changed a little bit over the past year or so with Mark Schultz's direction. Essentially, the research committee charge is to make sure that research is included in the other activities of CSAVR, like transition and management services and the other long-standing committees, so that research informs and guides what we do in our collective work in CSAVR. In Montana, we have just begun work with the JDVR TAC and WIN-TAC. I leave from here to go to a Region 8 meeting in North Dakota. I guess Region 8 now means CSAVR Region 8 because there are no more RSA regions, but nobody told us out west, I guess. So we still meet as a region and do lots of cool stuff, and WIN-TAC is coming to help us with educating us and guiding us. There's a lot happening, and a real need for the information. We felt so strongly about it in Montana that we actually contracted with the Rural Institute for Inclusive Communities at the University of Montana to help us build the VR school partnerships and transition, to educate both the school officials involved and our own VR counselors, so that we can really truly build a strong VR school partnership, because we take that charge very seriously. And so that's actually how we're spending some of our 15% reserve. And also because it's so important to look at competitive integrated employment and break the pipeline to segregated sub-minimum wage employment, which is really quite strong in the Rocky Mountain West, stronger than you'd think. And we're really hoping to do that kind of systems change too. So that's what we do.
Well, thank you. And Ellie, so you can be thinking if we could start this next question with you. And obviously the panel has a lot of experience in working with grants and universities and on research. And in considering that experience and looking back upon it, and also your current endeavors, what makes those good experiences? What makes you come away from those experiences, for lack of a better term, as a satisfied customer? So, Ellie?
I think the big thing is really, we kind of had a little discussion this morning about what are the things, what makes a good, how do you get this information? How is it shared in a way that is useful and that we can implement it? And struggling with the balance with having so much so much to do, so many different partners to respond to. With Promise, because it's an interagency collaboration, we look to the different partners. So earlier this month, I was at the NTAC Capacity Building Institute, for example, and so it's not just the federal partners and the entities within the grant, but we're also looking at the other ones. And so talking about how I get multiple emails from multiple listservs and webinars and things like that, and really trying, and then myself as a project manager, how to then share that information with the team. Promise is already based on evidence, but then how to implement it, share new things, help the team work on those things to be consistent and utilize that evidence. And there's a couple different things that I think are really helpful. One is providing the information and making sure to say, okay, what does this mean? Practical implications. So when there's practical implications up front from a specific practice, so rather than maybe spending a whole hour explaining something, being able to get that information through a fact sheet or a quick segment, maybe a video segment, things like that, something that we're actually building in Promise through Beth Wroblewski's here from Employment Resources Incorporated, ERI, and they help us build those things for our youth and families and our partners. But those one-pagers, those quick videos are helpful. The other thing that's helpful, and I noticed this earlier when David Test was talking, he came up with some things that my colleague Sarah and I were talking about, opportunity to have the chance to chat about, okay, how can we apply this and have that conversation? This is something we ask for when we do our Promise meetings, is time to collaborate within our own teams and then across the other states to how can we apply this rather than going through 2 full days and then having to find time to collaborate with your colleagues, having time to either talk in dialogue with the folks in the room, but also with your colleagues about, okay, how can we take this and apply it? So it's really taking that application and then the balance of getting the information and being able to apply it without it becoming another another task among because there's, like I said, there's a lot of things going on at once. So a way that aids and makes the process easier and helps with our implementation versus adding one more thing, one more demand that we have to respond to, one more report we have to write, one more thing we have to explain, but kind of incorporated within our daily going on to help make the process easier.
As a state agency, maintaining that good relationship, whether it's a university or a TA center or the federal entities, obviously it's critical for our success of our program. I will say that since, July of 2014, when WIOA came out, I feel like the world of rehab is on steroids right now and everything's moving really, really fast. And because so many things are changing quickly, it just adds a lot of layer of tasks to be completed and stress, obviously. And a lot of your states, and I'm certainly one of those experiencing some financial difficulties within our state, that adds that extra challenge, meaning maybe you don't have the staff to do the work that you want to do. So that also requires you to partner even more with those TA centers and the universities and the federal entities that are out there because of the situation that our state's in, and I know there's a lot of other states in the same boat, trying to figure out how to implement the requirements of WIOA and how to continuously improve the rehab program within those limitations that you really don't have a lot of control over. So that relationship piece is key. And to me, it requires, you know, respecting and understanding each other's expertise that they bring to the table. It's easy for me to stay in Kentucky in my bubble and basically say, oh, we know how to do it here. And you get someone from outside our state coming in saying, have you ever thought about this? This is a good thing that's happening in this state. And it's too easy for, especially my staff, to go, they don't understand, that's not what we have here. You know, things may be called differently in other states. You know, you may approach things a little bit differently, but you take what's working in that state and you try your best to figure out how does that work here. And honestly, I can't do it alone. We have to rely on those TA centers and those experts out there. So that's one of the things, is make sure that you understand that expertise coming in. The other thing is that good communication piece and communicating, and me making sure my staff are not going to understand anything you're saying. So let us work with you on how to put that in the terminology that they're doing daily, that they understand day-to-day activities on. So that to me is key, and how to keep that relationship there. And time is, I talked about, you know, WIOA felt like it's put us on steroids. Time is of the essence for the rehab agency, and that doesn't mean that you come to us timely with ideas. It means we don't have a lot of time. And so there's a lot of great things happening out there, but for a state agency to actually have the staff who can dedicate to something, to a project, that is the more difficult piece of it, the more difficult component. My state, it's a good example. We've had a new governor just elected, so we're in the middle of all this transition, and we have budget deficits, so it's really fun times. But because of all of those activity that's happening within our state, I can't pursue some of the technical assistance that I feel I need from a TA center, because I have to bring my new administration on board and get their buy-in before we pursue all this. So that means that I'm going back to the TA centers, to their websites. I mean, just earlier I saw the great resources that the Intact has on the transition. I'm going back to those resources that you're putting there, those learning collaboratives and stuff, and using that to fit within my agency. So it's very important that you're sharing those resources and what you're learning in the other states, because even though I may not directly have that TA assistance, I'm still getting the information from what you're putting out there. So that's much appreciated to the agencies.
I would definitely echo the fact that there isn't like a deep bench in a lot of VR agencies. We're doing the best we can, and it is hard. I know that one of the things that we did in Montana was we reorganized in order to be able to meet the challenges of the WIOA. And what we did was we eliminated 3 of our 5 regions, so that now we just have like a general statewide region and a blind statewide region, essentially. And we needed top state VR leaders to shift what they were doing so that we could actually pick up some of the workload. So now we have those regional administrators are now doing things like transitions specialists and employer services specialists and quality service specialists, kind of thing, so that we can actually respond. I would say, you know, the WIOA is so massive. I think many of you in the room have probably heard Commissioner Lebrecht say that there are over 100 changes. And of those changes, a lot of them are not like just changes in the weather, they're changes in climate. And it's a tall order to implement what the new national social policy is expecting of state VR agencies. So we need technical assistance and training that doesn't reinforce what we already know. I mean, you know, we're not looking to repeat what's in the past. We're looking into stepping into a very different future. And so we need technical assistance and training that changes the way we see things and the way we behave in the actions that we take to try and get different outcomes for employment of people with disabilities. So I guess I would just ask and urge, keep the cutting edge stuff coming. Keep the challenges coming. It's really important.
So I guess from my perspective, from the employer perspective or corporate, Fong, Dave, and Paul have always been, there's been a clarity of vision, a clarity or an alignment with SPR objectives, or at least I could establish an alignment with an SPR objective that made that relationship very tangible for our leadership. SPR is, while we have a lot of very entrepreneurial, creative, innovative people working, particularly around software development, portals and integration, SPR leadership is pretty conservative. And our CEO, Rob Filio, is quite conservative. I've known Rob for a long time. And so any relationship that I've established with an academic team has had to have had a very clear objective, endpoint, and set of almost down to task level for me, where I've been able to integrate it into my long-term initiatives for SPR logically. I mean, I tend to be pretty entrepreneurial and creative, and I think Fong, Dave, and Paul appreciate that. I have a lot of corporate relationships. I would say if there are academic teams out there looking to engage, or you need a partner on the corporate side in your region, I mean, fortunately, we all have access to a great deal of information online. So I would say go to their site, see what they're engaged in the broader community, see what their employees support in terms of nonprofits or efforts related to disability or whatever the population is your research is directed at. If you see some potential alignment, then get out in the community, meet them where they meet. Civic engagement is a great developing initiative in most larger urban centers across the country. And all of us can get engaged in civic tech, by attending hacks. And I can assure you, you'll meet a lot of private side folks if you get engaged in the civic hacking community. Those relationships can then develop somewhat organically. And if you have a need for a partner on the corporate side, that will become a more natural, I think, relationship at this stage. And I also think that Rob, I'm talking about our CEO, and Rob is very like, I think, any CEO or leader in that, they like to be known for doing something that is socially valuable or good. So, that is a driver. And if you can convince an organization or a company that you can help them establish a footprint of doing more good, that certainly is part of the value that my role has brought to SPR. But SPR has walked the walk. I mean, we have many of my colleagues engaged in these efforts. So I think you'll find willing partners, and I think it's a very fertile window for academic and private partnerships that you guys have spoken to. You spoke to WIOA, and I'm involved right now with a partnership with Microsoft an organization that I launched called ITCAN in 2008 as a professional development organization for candidates with disabilities into tech, and Directions Training, who is a WIOA certified trainer. And we're going to be launching a pilot of a small cohort of trainees into SQL Server and business analytics, business intelligence track. And I mean, it's a very exciting partnership because, frankly, between Directions and Microsoft and SPR, we will have an exit, a paid exit for these newly minted SQL Server DBAs on the other end. And so I really think academic partners are valued, by private industry, but it has to be a handshake and it has to align. And for you guys, it has to align, because you could find yourselves doing a lot of work and jumping through a lot of hoops that you didn't anticipate, if you partner with the wrong company. But anyway, that's my thinking.
Thanks, Pat. And Allison, if we could start this next question with you. And I think everybody has mentioned the WIOA, and we have the regulations that are due out in June, so that's going to add more to everybody's plate. And in looking at that, we also have new players with the new technical assistance centers, and NIDLR has released a number of new grants, and they have notices out for others to come. So in looking at the demands of WIOA, the upcoming regulations, other projects that you have, how can those entities introduce themselves to you most effectively, make sure they're aligning with what you want to achieve? And Pat, you mentioned, how do you align so that you help the business's footprint and help it grow and reach its objectives? So if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, WIOA, I think, is going to keep all of us in business because there's lots of work to be done. But I want to talk a little bit specifically about the pre-employment transition services. That's one of the biggest key changes within WIOA. But when you specifically look at your blind and visually impaired agencies, this is a huge challenge for those agencies that probably a lot of your university and TA centers are not fully aware of. In public rehab, nationally, the average age of consumer in the blind and visually impaired agencies is 43. In Kentucky, my average age is 40. So when the law says that you're going to spend 15% of the federal allotment on these specific pre-employment transition services for age 14, and in Kentucky it's up to 21, 14 to 21 for our state. It's different in other states, but age 14, when our average age of consumer is so much higher, can you imagine the challenges this has for our agency? And when you're an agency that doesn't have a lot of extra money, or you're returning those federal dollars because you don't have enough to match, that means that 15% takes away from your adult population, for lack of a better word. So there has to be some studies and strategies and implementations of new approaches on how the blind and visually impaired can focus on those pre-ET services, because that's a huge piece of WIOA, but also knowing that that is a much smaller population that the blind and visually impaired agencies are working with, a smaller number. So that, to me, is a big challenge for the blind and visually impaired agencies. And I want to tell you, the TA centers have done a good job in doing their webinars. One of my staff made a comment, said, I could pretty much listen to a webinar every day. And I was like, yeah, pretty much. So we have to, strategically think about which webinars are most beneficial for us and who has time to listen to the webinar. So we usually have one person try to listen, and they come back and share that information when we can, because obviously we just don't have the time to really sit and listen to all the webinars. So take this however you all want it. This is from an agency director perspective here. The intensive TA, I told you earlier that my agency had a strong interest in receiving some TA, specifically around the pre-ETs, because that's a big challenge for us. Once I had about 4 of my leadership staff sit in on that webinar and listen to the process and how to ask for technical assistance. And then what was involved if you were selected to get technical assistance. I'm going to tell you right now that my staff had the deer in the headlight look and went, there's no way. There is no way we can do this. So my state has not pursued technical assistance because of the application process and then because of what all is involved if you are selected. And I know this is not a reflection on the TA centers. This is a requirement as part of the grant. And someone who's been in rehab for 23 years, I've had grants with RSA way before WIOA and way before this new structure. And it has shifted, it has changed. So there's much more focus on that data collection and that research component. And unfortunately, a lot of that falls on the state agencies to provide that research, the data piece of it, and to provide and to collect it, which requires my staff doing all that. So I'm giving you the state director's perspective on this, that when we look at what it means to be selected as to get to intensive TA or to even apply for it, it's a little overwhelming for us. So I strongly encourage the TA centers to really think about what is the best way you can do this and still meet the requirements of the grant. I know you have to do that. But to make it the most simple approach you can on the state agencies, because like John said, we have the final regs get ready to come out, and this momentum we have is going to continue until we get things put in place. So
Allison, just a quick follow-up question.
That's not loud.
You're right. I mean, the process has been pretty much dictated. So if you were going to look at entering into an intensive TA arrangement, partnership, what would be the features that would cause you to do that? I mean, what kinds of things would you want to see the Technical Assistance Center offer, or to make it attractive to you and meaningful to you and your business?
I know one of the first steps, we've sit in on 2 or 3 different webinars for different TA centers on, hey, we're taking applications, this is how you do it. And we've seen the same process in all 3, so I feel like that's probably a requirement of the grant since we're seeing it similar. But one of the things was, as a state, you identify your problem area. Okay, pre-ETS and spending that money is our problem area. Number 2 is you come up with how you could implement some kind of program or project to meet that issue. Okay, so we're going to identify it, and then we're going to figure out how to fix it, right? So what do I need you for? Oh, because we're going to provide data to you. So you can do it. Does everybody understand? And I'm certainly not putting down any of the TA centers because I value all of them. And I've worked with you all for a long time. But you've got to make it very simple for the state agencies. And honestly, if I had the answers and how I could spend my 15%, I would have it spent. So that's another hurdle for me, is the how. I know what the what is, but the how, so how could I even fill out that TA application when I don't know what the how is? So which is why we're turning to all the evidence-based practices that are out there, trying to look and come up with something that would meet, what's happening in our state. Does that help?
A VR director can't say yes to everything. In fact, a lot of times they're pretty good at saying no, which is hard to think of, but it's true. I think it comes down to, like, this morning at one of the concurrent sessions that I attended, we were talking about the working alliance, the relationship between the client and counselor being one of the best predictors of successful outcomes. And it kind of speaks to the fact that it's really about relationships. And I guess in a relationship, it's built on common respect for what one another faces, and it is hard in state agencies. Massive amounts of change. I think, Allison, your example of the pre-employment transitions is excellent, because VR counselors sign up to work with adults, and now all of a sudden we're working with 14-year-olds and their parents and their IEP teams, and a whole bureaucracy that we don't even speak the same language as education does a lot of times, K-12 education. We actually don't even speak the same language as the Department of Labor either, by the way. It took me a long time to understand that a PEARL is their version of our technical assistance circular in education. And so it is kind of, you have to pay attention to that kind of stuff. But I guess that what really helps is things like this conference that I'd ask that each of the technical assistance centers get out of their silos and collaborate and work together like we are here, over this couple of days, to make sure that there is a more unified front. It feels like a lot of chaos, and somehow we got to try and make order out of all that chaos.
Yeah, John, maybe you can characterize that from my perspective. I am honestly not sure that I have relevant insights on this question.
Okay. Well, but I think you provide a lead into maybe the next question.
Okay.
You all have information, knowledge that's very valuable. You have experiences, your staff have experiences. There are I see a lot of requests. I used to see these as a state director. I see them now with CSAVR. You're getting requests from researchers, technical assistance centers, universities. Well, can you help us recruit X number of people to take this survey? Can you help us recruit folks to be in focus groups? Can you help us recruit folks to be on advisory groups? Can you reach out to your business community and recruit businesses to talk to us about what they need and roundtables and so forth? So, and getting that information is certainly important. And as you get those requests and think about them, what are the components or features that attract you to some versus others? And Pat, earlier, I think in the conversation this afternoon, you mentioned the issue of alignment. So you did give us a lead in, so thank you. So
You're welcome for that segue.
I need segues. So Jim, do you want to maybe talk a little bit about this or to lead off on that one?
Sure. I guess I'm trying to, I wasn't prepared to speak first, although I guess I should have been. I'm a typical Western guy. I like to edit before I open my mouth if I can help it. I guess that the thing I guess I would say is it's really, I think, important to have information that is succinct and meaningful, that can fit in with what we're doing. We're juggling all the relationships with the different partners and stuff that we're engaged with now, that we find ways of bridging all the different languages we have to speak now. And so I think in terms of the support for states, the more that the technical assistance centers can be succinct and meaningful in their support of what we do, it would be most helpful. So.
Okay. Are we going this way? Or? Okay. You want me to go next? Yeah. I do want to say that research is extremely important, but it's got to be relevant to what we're doing, and it's got to be in a way that is easy for us to explain to our legislators, or it's easy to explain to our cabinet leadership folks, because those are the ones that we, as public rehab agencies, we have to sell this new program that we're going to implement, or we need to be able to argue why that's not a good approach. And so that's why research is important, because I always tell my staff, it's hard to argue with data. So I do value data, but you also have to have it in a way that is usable for us. So I can't hand, like my cabinet secretary, a beautifully written piece of research, because he's going to go, I don't understand this. So I got to be able to put things in perspective. So that's when you're conducting your research and sending, and I always am one that will pass along any request for volunteers for surveys and focus groups and all that, because I do think it's important to have that input. But I think, like Jim said, and John's alluding to, that we have to be careful that we don't overload our staff or inundate them, because then they're going to start, didn't I just finish this one? Didn't I do this one? It all starts getting blurry with us. So if you're approaching us, just keep that in mind. We probably had 3 the day before. And so if you can explain really well what your research is and why I should forward this on to my staff, or why I should complete it, that's always helpful as well.
In Wisconsin Promise, it is a big research grant, so there's a lot of data we're collecting, which is really figuring out, it's partially, what we signed up for, but then figuring out the balance of what does the staff do and what does the eval work group do has been really interesting. So we have enrolled 2,024 youth and families. It's random assignment. So we are working with 1,018 youth and families. And we've got a variety of different things. One of the things we did is built a lot of the data elements right in the DVR case management system called IRIS here in Wisconsin, so that helped a lot. So they already had a case management system, they already knew that. That was a big step for us. Other states had to build that from scratch. And then we could add the different components we needed for Promise. That helped a lot. We have a dashboard that helps us track on a regular basis, and that's a great component. And then we also have additional surveys, and I'm also on the eval team, so I know that these surveys were things that I was like, we need baseline surveys and follow-up surveys and working alliance surveys, and then surveys for each of our service components. There's a lot of surveys. I'm like, who thought of all these? So what we're seeing with our staff are completing, and they're doing a pretty good job. They got over 600 of the baseline surveys already completed. We just finished enrollment at the end of April. But then you look at the youth and parent surveys, because they're also doing the same baseline survey, but from their perspective. So you get the perspective from the youth and families, and we've got just over 100 youth surveys done and just over 200 family surveys, which is a lot, except for the fact that our goal is for all the family members to have an opportunity to complete that survey. And the staff they've invited the family to take the survey, they've done a follow-up, and that's about what numbers we're at. And so once you get to that point, if we want to get above and beyond that, it's really now up to our eval team to help to do that follow-up, because our staff really they're providing that service. They're connecting with all those services, and they can't spend their whole time trying to get follow-up on the surveys. So it's that balance of, we can help connect to folks to take surveys or to connect to focus group, but then that balance of they still have their work they've got to do too. So sometimes the legwork, it has to be the shared work. We have Mathematica coming next week, and they're going to do focus groups. And the nice thing is they asked for, we have a data agreement, so that helps a lot. But they asked for a list of youth and families in the Milwaukee area and what their engagement is. And we have an engagement, that's one of the measures that's tracked in our case management system. And so I was able to provide that, and then along with the contact information, so that Mathematica could contact the youth and families directly, versus us having to then find a place for the focus group, invite all the families, do all that logistics. So that was nice. So we could provide them with the data they needed so that they could set up that focus group, and that took that piece off my plate, which I've got we've got our own focus groups we're doing with the state eval and multiple other things. And so it's really that partnership. Yeah, we can help you out, but please don't put all that onus on us. Let's do it in a shared way.
So I think from the corporate perspective, I would kind of support your points on dashboarding, or again, creating a very tactical approach to the research for your corporate partner. Filter things down to the point. Don't get. I love to think I'm a Renaissance man and that I'll get into the research and, Fong's data, and, trust me, over the years, Fong's, Pat, please, just leave my data alone. Just, my data's my data, Pat. Here's what you can do for us. So I think that is critical, that you partner, that you have a trusting relationship with a partner. In fact, we had 3 deep focus groups. The first research, the first grant that, I partnered with Fong and Dave on, required, or we determined that it required 3 deep corporate focus groups, kind of senior HR as well as senior hiring manager profiles. And again, these were tactical efforts that I could initiate and manage, saving Fong and Dave and their teams the efforts of blindly approaching companies. I had a relationship. The enablement channel was known to these companies. And I think you have to know that whoever you partner with is trusted by other companies out there. So, do your diligence on the front end. In our case, I think Fong and Dave recognized that we were. We ended up having a focus group at Harley-Davidson's Research Center here in Milwaukee, and then one in the northwest suburbs of Chicago at Walters Kluwer, and a third at Blue Cross Blue Shield. And they represented about 22 to 24 different companies. From those focus groups, Fong and their teams, distilled that information, and then we created a very expansive online survey. And from that, ultimately, we published, Fong leading a publication in an OT journal in 2010, Midwest Employers Survey on perceptions of productivity of colleagues with evident disabilities, vision, hearing, mobility. And I think, again, successive to that, I've always had very discreet asks of me from researchers. And I then need to take those, obviously, to leadership at SPR, or I report to our president. So I meet monthly with him. I fold this in, and it helps now that we are receiving consulting fees. Obviously, that speaks to private enterprise. And I think it's fair because clearly there's effort on my end, and we're extending our client relationships on behalf of these research teams. And so there is trust involved, very similarly, I think, to you guys, and reaching across to other teams. So to me, it comes down to align with a partner at a high level. See that you've got a story to tell that would be of interest to them. Have a strategic other within that company, meaning someone who you think can carry the water, right? Can take that story and drive it through their organization to get you that partnership. And then make sure that they have the bandwidth to carry out your tactical needs. Because otherwise it will end up damaging the research effort, I think. And I think we've walked, and I jokingly say that, I like to get into the research. Well, if I'm really going to be honest, I like to read the abstracts. So I like to read the cliff notes and get a sense of the research, and that's a healthy relationship, I think, that at least I'm informed enough. to understand at a high level what the PhDs are trying to achieve and what the outcome, the intended outcome is. And then I do what I do, which is develop client relationships, extend my relationships on behalf of the research teams, and I hope strengthen the research. And I think at least Paul, Dave, Tim, Fong must think that, I and SPR are doing that, because I can't imagine they would continue to partner with us.
Thank you. I wasn't here this morning when Dr. Wayman spoke, but Dr. Wayman said Fong was in the galactic sphere of researchers, and now you know why. He knows Pat. So I know we're coming to the end of the hour. We have just a couple minutes left, and in closing, I just wanted to ask if each of you could take a minute or less, if you could give just one piece of advice to the technical assistance centers, the NIDLR and DOL grantees, the universities wanting to work with you, do research to support you and your staff, well, what would that be? And if anyone, we'll just turn it over to you, whoever would like to lead off.
Everybody's looking at me. Yeah, I think I've talked to this question a little bit. The simplified process, obviously. I think that constant communication with your public VR agencies is important, and making sure you're building that relationship and you know who your key players in each state are. Jim alluded earlier to that regional model, which is what we were used to. Chip Kinney, who's now with the WinTech out in San Diego State University, was my Region 4 TASTE person. So I do have that relationship with Chip, but now he's no longer in my region. Now he's looking at the whole country. So I have to share him now. But it's the same. He obviously needs to know the other regions that he didn't work with as closely. So I would encourage that, and making sure you're staying on top of what the challenges of those public VR agencies are and what our needs are.
My advice is basically just a repeat of what I said before. Challenge us, but please keep it succinct and meaningful.
So I would say, I would just repeat a line, the objectives of your research effort, and tell a story, kind of a distilled story to a prospective partner on the corporate side. And I would say perform some diligence on the front end to make sure that you feel they're trustworthy and that they will extend and support the research to the extent that you need it, and treat them fairly. And I think there are many exciting partnerships to be established between academia and the private side, and I think they're required. Productivity has changed dramatically. Our labor force is continually shifting and changing dramatically. Our competitiveness in the global market is changing dramatically. These monies can't be wasted. If these monies are on the table for these grants, and you're really bright people investing a lot in your educations, I think, again, distill a story down, tell it to a private partner, and take advantage of that relationship, to really strengthen the research outcome.
And I think what I'll say, in addition to what everyone else has said, so I'll say something a little different, because I agree with what has been said here, is when sharing the information, when sharing the knowledge, quality over quantity. I would prefer, for quarterly, 20-minute, here's, something from the literature that applies to us, do 4 really good ones over the course of the year that we can really take and bring into practice, versus trying to have to weed through multiple webinars, multiple newsletters every week. So if, banding together and really thinking about the quality of the information and the practical implications of that information over and above trying to give us everything all at once, because then it's hard, the task becomes on us to weed through all that. So that's more on like the knowledge translation side of things. So.
Well, thank you. I certainly want to thank our panel this afternoon. Hopefully you got a lot of good takeaways. Some of the things I heard, and a lot of it seems to boil down to relationship in terms of trust, understanding, fairness, making sure that your message is clear, you have a good story to tell, you pick a good organization to work with to get that story out into that industry. Recognizing what's on the plate of the partners that you want to reach out to, and figuring out how you can best help them. So again, I want to thank our panel. And